Now, okay, so this part right here, I think if you take the advanced anatomy and physiology, you might have to memorize these functions, but for this class, don't worry too much about them. But know that, so things that these different pathways, they carry certain types. They don't carry all sensations, but they actually carry certain types of sensations. So the spinal thalamic pathway we just talked about, it carries sensations of temperature, pressure, and crude touch, pain. So this is associated with the spinal thalamic pathway. Whereas the posterior column, proprioception, and also this and other specialized types of touch as well. That's kind of bummer about being online. We used to have all these demonstrations where I showed you like what these involve, but what I'm getting at here is that you have all these special things. Like notice that vibration wasn't part of the spinal thalamic, and all these other types of functions and sensations. These aren't carried by that spinal thalamic pathway. And then spinal cerebellar functions. Well, remember your cerebellum is very important in things like muscle memory. And spinal cerebellar is actually, this is probably the easiest one. Spinal cerebellar is associated with your sense of proprioception. Because again, remember your cerebellum controls all things like muscle memory, learn reflexes, and all these other things you use in terms of like refining and controlling your body movement. So it kind of makes sense. This, and thankfully, it's one of the easiest pathways. So again, this is why is it important to know those functions? Why do you have to know that for advanced classes? Well, thing is like it knows that all these pathways are located at different parts of the spinal cord. So say someone has gets an injury to their spine and it damages part of their spinal cord. Say they start losing their sense of proprioception or balance. Well, maybe that means they damage the parts of the spinal cerebellar pathway. Or say they can't feel, they have abnormal senses of things like vibration or being able to feel where an object is. Maybe they damage their posterior column pathway. So it kind of goes in hand with the neurological exam, but that's more of a advanced topic. So that's why like people memorize those lists, or you have to if you're a physician, you have to know those lists of functions with those pathways. And I know this always shows up in like I've seen it especially in like nursing and medical school memes. They look at this weird, funny looking picture, and so people are like, I mean, whenever I see students and they see this picture, like they always give it a look like, what the hell is that? So what is that? What is this weird thing? This is what you call the cortical homunculus. And yes, it looks like a person, but it looks like a very distorted person. And why is it distorted? Well, what it is a very rough map. So it's a rough map showing proportions of areas of your brain that's dedicated to certain parts of your body. So notice that things like, okay, so your entire leg. I mean, your leg is a pretty big part of your body, right? But compared to that, you see that things like your hands and your arms, they have a lot more of the surface and neurons of your brain and your cerebral cortex. So things like your hands, your fingers, your thumb have a lot more neurons dedicated to it proportionately than other things like your legs and hips and even your back. Not too many compared to smaller structures, but that's also why your fingers are more sensitive. Or things like your lips, way more sensitive. Like if you have your trunk, like you might not be able to feel if a fly landed on your back, but if a fly lands on your fingers or if it lands on your lips, you probably would know, right? So the thing is that again, this is why it's distorted, just because it means that if it the bigger the body part is on this homunculus, that means you have more of that cortex and more of the neurons in the cortex devoted to that body part. So again, larger areas means that more neurons are dedicated to that part of the body. So here's the somatosensory cortex. Let's zoom in a bit. So again, what we have here are different parts, and actually it's interesting because the somatosensory cortex, like you have different body parts. Yeah, so entire leg compared to things like your face and your hands, your entire leg gets like less real estate than everything up here, right? But again, this is why everything up here is way more sensitive than something touching your leg. But yeah, so here we have like Again, you have some parts that are devoted to your eye, tongue, lips, and mouth. So yeah, this is what I'm getting at with the primary somatosensory cortex. It's like a rough map showing roughly how much of the proportion of the brain of these cortexes or your cerebral cortex is devoted to that body part.